My name is John Barry, Executive Director of Design West Michigan here at Kendall College of Art and Design. This is the last plenary session of the 2.5 days. And a plenary session is indeed about a gathering of everybody at the beginning of any sort of organization, but it's also at the end to see if indeed there are any outcomes, issues, anything that we might be learning from. So we have 3 really interesting respondents here who I'm going to ask each one to identify themselves. And then I'm going to start by asking one of them to reflect on what they have seen in the time that they've been here, what they've heard, what they've learned, and be able to share with us some thoughts, reflections, impact from such a gathering, and what kind of value they see in having these sorts of things. So, Anthony, say a little bit about yourself.
Anthony Fontenot, I'm associate professor at Woodbury University School of Architecture.
Nice to have you here from California. Just heard a great talk about the California-Michigan connection, and it was so good that Michigan could help California become better.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Susan?
I'm Susan Sanasi. I'm the editor-in-chief of Metropolis magazine. I've been there for 29 years, and I've been recently made publisher, so now I'm in charge of the whole shebang, which is pretty daunting. And I've been coming to Grand Rapids, Holland, Zealand for at least 30 years. So I know the furniture industry really well. I'm learning about the boat industry, which is really fascinating, and I have a lot of questions about that. I have a lot of interest in the other industrial production areas in this field, so I'm really saturated with all of this now, so thanks for asking.
Wonderful. It's great to have you here. And Reed Kroloff.
I'm Reed Kroloff, and for the last 7 years I have been very, very fortunate to have been allowed to be the steward of the Cranbrook Academy of Art, about which we've heard so much in the last several days, and where this exhibition and conference originally premiered about a year ago, thanks to the incredibly hard work of the folks from SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, that have championed the idea of this program for half a decade or more, and so seeing it come to fruition now and learning about it has been, and as someone who's attached to Cranbrook, been a great personal pleasure.
Susan, I'd like to start with you. Reflections on the experience here? What would you like to say?
I would like to say that I am so pleased to be here and so pleased to see so many things that I wasn't aware of and sort of peripherally aware of. The show is fantastic. I have a little bit of time this afternoon. I'm going to go back and read every label, so if they let me into the museum. And I think one of the things that I loved about all of this is that I knew some of the architecture, but I didn't know the extent of the architecture that exists here. And the extent of the really personal interpretations of modern, which were really interesting to me, because modern is presented as a kind of a very uptight kind of an aesthetic that has left most people out of its sphere of reference because it's very hard to relate to. And yet in Michigan there are some amazing examples of modern design. Of course the furniture is spectacular, and the idea that the furniture companies are at the forefront, have always been at the forefront of breaking through to things that how people live at first, and then how people work, and constantly adapting themselves to this idea of constant movement through various skills in society as technology changes. So now the furniture industry is its newest phase of modernism, and I'd like to think about modernism, that what we saw as a prelude to the next phase, because I really feel that this is an ongoing project. And one of the things that I loved, one of the quotes was, and I think anything Gunnar Burkert says is fine with me, and he said something about modernism being about invention, about exploration, about new materials, new ideas. And when you think about that, when you think about what you're seeing in Michigan modernism, everything that you see has been invented. And a lot of it has been invented here because remember, we come from a world of wood and brick and concrete, and we ended up in a world of glass and steel and chemistry. So I mean, this is huge what we have been through in the past 70 years. And the kind of personal and regional outcome of this is incredibly inspiring. And it's a kind of confluence, it represents a confluence of government, business, entrepreneurship, individual guts and know-how, incredible human endeavor. So I'm just really jazzed about this, and I just want to keep looking at this now.
You're a good one to get jazzed, so I'm very glad that has indeed happened. Anthony, can you give us some of your reflections?
Yes, I've jotted down some notes. Given that I'm also an historian, my instinct was to try to understand the significant role that kind of Michigan modern played throughout the 20th century. And for me, the first thing that I took note of, which Eric Hill gave a fantastic overview, I was interested in the relationship between the Beaux-Arts versus the Prairie School. Already we see a kind of regional aesthetic that challenges a dominant aesthetic at work. And I think that's really significant. It also went on to try to attempt a new kind of aesthetic that, again, coming from a region. And I'm interested in its impact, the subsequent influence that it had on international styles, including the Stil, the Bauhaus, etc. It's also noteworthy to me that from Louis Sullivan to Frank Lloyd Wright, we see this interest in organic architecture and organic design coming out of this region specifically. That whole philosophy that was developed here had a massive impact on design throughout the 20th century, but more specifically in the mid-20th century, the notion of organic design will play a central role. And that's, to me, what's really interesting. But a new generation of designers are going to reinterpret what organic design is. And we're going to see in the 1940s, especially at the MoMA competition, that some very, Charles Eames and Sarin are going to win with Organic Armchair in 1941, win first place, which is to say, organic design is now being launched as a critique of the kind of international style of the Bauhaus version of a European design. So this American, European, the differences in how we interpret what modern design is to be. Again, I see Michigan playing a central role in that, and I think this is really important. We can follow throughout the kind of, in my understanding, the move from a kind of cold, austere European notion of a reduced formal language into a kind of design that is responsive to the human body, one that is comfort, one that is dealing with the kind of choices of the individual, starts to manifest itself in this organic design movement, and I think that becomes evident. To me, that's a really important thing. The third and final point I'd like to make is that something called Detroit styling, which is a kind of interest in the relationship between industrial design and the consumer. And this had, while we saw in the presentation today on Bill Geddes, we know that that's been at work in American industrial designers since the 20s and 30s, but a renewed interest in that happened in the 60s by young British designers such as Peter and Alison Smithson, as well as Rainer Banham, who were largely responsible for staging the Detroit styling, customization of design, allowing the individual to have a kind of a consumer individualism, let's call it, and its role in design had a massive impact in the 60s. The neo-avant-garde like Archigram, this was at the center of those debates, that customization and that the consumer culture would be a whole new kind of idea or philosophy in the 1960s. Again, we find the origins coming out of Detroit. We see it out of not just the auto industry, but in the entire kind of the furniture industry. So to me, Michigan modernism plays an incredibly complex role throughout the 20th century, and I think it continues to. But those are three specific points that I'd like to maybe open up for later discussion.
We're going to expand on all those. But Reed, before I ask you, I've got to jump in here a little bit, Anthony. and identify myself as a designer trained, actually a Cranbrook grad a lot of years ago, lived for a long time on the other side of the state, now lived over here. And I think it's helpful to understand the difference between styling and design, because I think there is a significant difference. And a professor of mine, design professor, made this point, that if you look at the cars that were designed at that period of time, you had cars which had bumpers put on them, and bumpers were of course meant to be able to absorb a certain kind of impact, so they were there as a protection. But they weren't really designed because they also had bumper guards put on bumpers, so they weren't really solving the problem. So I would say that real design is about solving the problem, and styling becomes more about an affectation or in some cases an economic gain to the company. So you'll see my bias over there pretty quickly.
I think that's interesting. I guess my point is to say, at the moment in the 1950s, when European modernism came under attack,
Right?
throughout, not just in Europe, but throughout, what was held up, at least in the British scene, what was held up as an alternative is the American commercial model, or this notion of styling loosely labeled, whether it's design or style. And I think this new philosophy of design in general is what I'm interested in.
No,
that it
that's
shifts
good.
from a European sense to an American sensibility, which is based on the consumer and his role in the design process.
And that'll give me a platform for a little bit later when I want to talk about, when you think of Michigan, probably being the state that has the biggest impact on the way people live, work, and move around than any other state. Where did human-centered design really come from? That'll get interesting. Reed, your reflections.
What we've just heard, I think, are great. I've been trying to look at this from the broadest possible perspective that I could, and take away messages that might be transferable to the present. And to me, as a result of that, as I've looked back, what comes out of this to me is a couple of processes that seem very, very clear. One that I'm going to just loosely say it sounds to me like synthesis and transformation, where no matter where we've been looking, whether it was looking at California, Michiganders who moved to California, or whether we stay here, we see over and over again people synthesizing a variety of inputs and transforming them into something new. So whether that synthesis was at Cranbrook something like European modernists coming and synthesizing the production capacity of industrial Detroit with the arts and crafts traditions of the furniture making business on the west side of the state, and coming together, and out the other side comes the Eameses and that kind of, and Herman Miller and that sort of thing, to an architectural synthesis, which I think is a little clearer and a little easier. The European modernists coming together with the Frank Lloyd Wright tradition of a site-based architecture, landscape-based architecture, and producing out the other side of that the incredible efflorescence of modernism in this state and ultimately in California as well. And then the second thing that strikes me as, and I should say, and that continues to this day, or it has the potential to continue to this day. The second thing that strikes me as being strongly present is a democratization of design, if you will, and I think you begin to talk about that a little bit, Anthony, where design goes from something that is purely the realm of the elite, purely the realm of the other, to very expensive, and really the evolution of Herman Miller. We saw that in the presentation on Threads this morning from a company that makes kind of awful-looking traditional furniture that, Steve, what was the quote about that? It was custom-made antique? Antiques made to order, which I just loved that this morning. Antiques made to order, to a completely universalizing tendency, at least on the popular side of the furniture of the Eameses and those sorts of things, where everyone could have it and could buy a chair for just a couple, even in today's money, for a couple $100s, that's clearly a very highly designed object. So, and that, I think, continues to this day, and it's Michigan's presence in the automobile industry as well, or Michigan's inheritance in the automobile industry, something that is designed but available to larger audiences.
A question, we're going to bounce back and forth here a little bit, but these symposiums are wonderful because they're engaging, they're new energy, they're new thoughts, new insights. My question, which I hope is not offensive to anyone, is so what? What's the next thing that ought to happen, or what are the kinds of things that should come out of this to make sure in the future we're capitalizing on, benefiting from, restoring, maintaining those things which are going on right now, because we are living another age. And how do we make sure that we don't worry about some of the things that Brian has talked about and others, where some of the incredible minds and the results of their activities are being lost. So it's a different time. So so what about symposiums like this? What are your views on that?
Can we,
Susan?
well, can we evaluate some of the things that we've seen that are
Yes.
ongoing?
Yes.
Because I think, we have various interpretations of certain language, certain words at certain times, and they keep coming back but reborn. And so the idea of organic design was a very different kind of organic. When Wright was practicing it, he was practicing it under less technologically sophisticated times, and therefore he really understood what the physical organism of the earth and nature were about and how to relate his buildings to the site and to the place. And so that idea of organic being part of the built environment, being part of the natural environment, and both benefiting from each other is a hugely important idea right now. So an organic design, not as a style, not as a shaping, not as a kind of biomimicry form giving, but a real deep down understanding of what it means to connect our buildings, our products, ourselves to the natural environment, and how do we think about that, and how do we put the human being at the center of all of this. That is really, really interesting to me right now.
Yeah, the
Can I add-
redefinition of those terms.
Yes.
That's a wonderful thought.
Can I add to that?
Oh, yes.
I also think it's important to think about, and we haven't spent enough time, I think, as a discipline to understand the relationship between these fundamental concepts of organic design and what that means for this concept called context that's going to emerge in the 1950s and 60s. Robert Venturi at Princeton wrote his master's thesis on context in architecture. By the 1960s, the notion of site specificity and context was central to art practices. So there's an entire legacy that has come out, and I agree that today, the relationship between site and site specificity and a kind of a new regional understanding and the way architecture engages that is wide open, and I think there's a kind of interesting new interest. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not a matter of holding on to these original intentions, but it's seeing how these ideas evolve over time. The other thing I would say is you're asking why review this today.
Right.
I think what I've learned through study, almost any avant-garde has come out of an intense scrutiny of a kind of historical processes that then recuperate a kind of critical edge by re-examining a historical process and launching anew. So I think here in Michigan, it's a kind of ripe time to re-examine the history, assess what's been done, and open it up for a kind of new era.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you from a Californian to say what you just said. Reed, do you want to add into this conversation?
Well, I think your question about so what is a double-edged question. One, it's an obvious John Barry provocation, which is why it's fun to have you on running panels on a regular basis, as you know I believe in, having put him on panels myself. It has two sides. So what is the question, so what of what does history mean? Why do we have our eyes focused in the rearview mirror? What can we bring forward out of that? And that's, of course, the question history always brings forward, and you hope there's a lesson there. And I think that's already been addressed. The answer to that, so what, has just been addressed by Susan and Anthony. The second so what is, so what now? And Michigan has been caught in a so what now spin cycle for a long, long time. And trust me, everybody is baked here from asking that question for so long. And it's a difficult question to answer because you spend so much time. It's the question of the defeated. It's a hand-wringing question that sort of makes you sad to even ask. you got to go to the first so what and forget the second so what. You have to go to the first so what, look at whatever these lessons are, and move on. Move on. Stop trying to tie yourself in or lash yourself with the what we have been. Oh, woe is us. Our greatest days are behind us. And move to the forward. Move forward on that. I always think of what must it have been like to have been someone in Rome in 542 AD? Oh, how sad for them. Could they have predicted that 542, that 400 years later, they would once again be running the whole world? Could they have? And what did the one institution that made that all happen? Did they just run around looking behind them? Well, yes, they're a history-based institution. They're an institution based strictly on a set of historical events. But they move forward very, very quickly with new directions of conquest, if you will. So there's no reason. Michigan, I was just having this conversation on the way over here. Michigan still has all the natural resources. Michigan still has the biggest base of manufacturing and technology of any state. Michigan still has the second largest agricultural production base in the United States. Michigan still has one of the largest higher education systems in the United States and one of the best.
Michigan also has more industrial designers in it than any other state.
I was going to get that quote. You took it right out of my mouth. Yeah, I was going to say, yesterday we heard that fact from you. Thank you. I was going to bring that back. What does Rhode Island have? Nothing. You know, what do you really have if you live in Wyoming? Cattle dung. I mean, these states they cannot compete with a place like this. Enough already with the hand wringing. We've got what we need. Let's move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And Reed, you do know me well enough to know that was a double.
But I'd like to put this into an American context, because I'm out there talking to a lot of design offices, and the hand wringing is everywhere. It's everywhere. So it's not unique to you. What's unique to you, as Reed says, are your resources. So the resources that are here do not exist in many of the places that I visit. For instance, what's in Atlanta? I mean,
Nothing.
Heat. I don't know.
A lot of tall towers.
Tall towers that are designed to be gas guzzlers and oil guzzlers, and are really burning up a lot of coal and a lot of fuel to keep them going. So I think what's interesting here, and also you didn't mention wind power.
I was just going to, that's so good. I'm glad you said that. Wind power.
Wind power is huge.
Are we the
It's
third largest?
developing.
I think we're the third largest state for wind power now. I think.
I don't
After
know. I don't know
Texas,
that,
yeah,
but
yeah.
It's high. I know
It's
that.
right there.
Yeah.
Wind power, not only that. Water. I mean, water, it's huge. And this whole incredible plan for the Great Lakes watershed that SOM and a lot of people are working on, it's spectacular. It's really, really interesting. It's almost like the rebirth of an area is at hand.
You know, people in Michigan, they love to say this to you. It just kills me every time. Do you know that we control 20% of the world's fresh water supply? And then the follow-up is this. Nothing. There's no follow-up, right? There's just no follow-up. It's like, oh my God, forget all the rest of that stuff. This is 97% of your body. If you want to control the one industry that's going to matter in the future, this might be it.
And it doesn't need to come in a plastic bottle.
No, it shouldn't come in a plastic bottle.
So,
Anthony.
So my comment to this would be that if in the 1930s and 40s we saw the role that industry played, and then we saw the relationship it had with the designers and design disciplines, today I would ask in Michigan, and this I don't know, is what role are the industries playing in terms of sustainable energy, in terms of renewable energy, all of the cutting edge issues that are affecting us, what role are the industries playing? And in turn, I would ask, what role do they invite the designers to play in those innovations?
I know a little bit about that one from this side of the state, from the furniture companies. I would tell you that the furniture companies actually led that whole issue on LEED established the Green Building Council. They were really the catalyst to pull that together, and still are. So they were very much coming from that base. And you heard some things about Herman Miller early on, way before it was an issue. That was just part of the ethos of the company. So I would say there's been a leading effort here for that. The state as a whole, I think, is just coming onto that lately. But your question has to do with design and how designers are reflecting on that. I think I can make this statement for at least all the big three here. I don't think anything can be designed if it is not almost completely recyclable, sustainable. I mean, there are design parameters on that. Steve, would you, at least from a Herman Miller side? I was in the early 80s. Here's this. I was at Herman Miller for a lot of years. When that was built, it was absolutely, it was providing the energy for the main site, but there wasn't enough waste being produced to actually give all the energy that was needed. So they were getting waste from Hayworth to come over and be burned in Herman Miller's Energy Center.
So, and then let's not forget the bees at Herman Miller.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
The
the
bees. The bees are huge. So, you all know the story, right? I mean, it's amazing to me that somebody was just going to wipe them out through some DDT or whatever, and this was going to be the answer. Well, not at Herman Miller. So now you have honey, and you have, I mean, it's a design thinking at work at every level. It's not like, you're just kind of designing a chair, but you're thinking about the whole problem of figuring out how to make things work. And that's a really valuable resource here.
And it is all problem-based.
Yeah.
It's absolutely problem-based. I mean, the bees came about because there were wasps, and the wasps were natural predators to the bees, or the bees were natural predators to the wasp, and all of that. But I guess I'm going to go off to a little bit of a side, but our discussion of style, design, and problem solving, there's an Eames quote here which fits, which Charles Eames would say, the degree to which a designer has a style is the degree to which they never solve the problem.
Yeah,
Just
that's right.
kind of an
Now,
interesting point.
can I add something here, John? Because
yep.
I think I was talking to the folks at BIFMA, Business and Institutional Furniture Manufacturers Association, which is very strong here in Grand Rapids and in its various cities where manufacturing goes on. And there is going to be a fabulous program for listing the contents of the products, because there's a huge pressure from the design industry of really understanding what's in every product. And it's an enormous problem, and only the manufacturers can undertake that, because you start unzipping one chemical, there's 10 chemicals within. And the manufacturers are very serious about doing this. So it's part of that humanist West Michigan approach to design, that ethical, right, straight thinking kind of, concerned community that is here that is making that happen. And they assure me there's funds to do that.
Oh, yeah. No, that doesn't surprise me at all. But Anthony, I'm picking off of your question here about what is the state doing around sustainability. And I would tell you, I think it's absolutely a leader. Does it talk about itself that way? No.
No.
But
I'm sorry, you
think
say
there's good
it
evidence.
is a leader.
I do.
And
Yeah, I
can
really
you give
do.
us 3 examples in the way the state is forging this new
Herman
territory?
Miller Hayworth steel case.
Yeah.
I would ask for us to think beyond the furniture industries. I would say maybe that's the easy one. What about energy and the larger, more complex industries,
Yep.
and then to see what role they might play to inviting designers to tackle much
Wind
more
energy.
difficult problems?
Wind energy is big.
Wind is
Yeah.
big, yeah.
Yeah, and actually boating is doing some very
Yeah.
interesting things. I don't know enough about the automotive industry to be able to answer that, but and Reed, maybe you do, but I'm quite sure that that's primary to a design process. It just has to be. I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, the word sustainability wasn't, much more than green marketing wash, and now it's a given and a requirement. You just can't do anything without it.
I would love
there's
to.
been-
I would love to understand just the notion of transportation that was so central to the
Right.
history of the state. What does transportation mean today? How are we reinventing it? What role do designers play in that discussion here?
I wish I knew the answer to that. And if somebody in the audience does, please
There's someone there.
come. Yes, could you? Yeah.
Yes.
My name's Jana Wallace. I work for the City of Grand Rapids. I'm also part of Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc. We're the most sustainable medium-sized city in the United States, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We have more LEED certified buildings in Grand Rapids than any other city in the state, or in the country, sorry, per capita. And in terms of transit, the voters have just approved, actually over the last 10, 15 years, a new millage for a transit system. We've also had increases every year, or every third year. Each time we've got a train, Silver Line, that's coming from the south of town all the way through. It's going to be a bus, so it's a bus rapid transit. The signals will change to allow the bus system to go through, so you can come all the way through. So if you've been in front of DeVos Place, you've probably seen some kind of futuristic looking, actually mid-century modern looking bus stations where they're kind of cantilevered out. Those have all been put in by our local transit authority. So in terms of automotive design, we don't do a lot of that here except for in pieces. Furniture design, we're very sustainable. One of the largest donors for a nonprofit building is Peter Wegge. Peter will not give any money to a new building project unless it's LEED certified, which is one reason why we have so many. He paid for a large part of the Grand Rapids Art Museum. He's also supported the ballet, which is LEED certified, and our opera building is also LEED certified.
John?
Could I add something here?
So,
Yeah, sorry. My hand was up before yours. So what we saw yesterday in the architectural presentation, and we've been kind of familiar with all of that, the Albert Kahn, the Rouge plant, and the kind of its conversion from automotive to war production and emergency production, producing other things than what they were producing. So the capability of these factories is there, and if they decide, if the U.S. begins to decide that mass transit is really important to us as a nation, as a country, as a part of the world that we're dominating, then I would say that there could be one of those shifts within the technical manufacturing area here that could re-energize the car industry into a transportation industry. Because I think that's going to start happening whether most people like it or not, because of the way we're densifying cities, the way we're using land, the way we're thinking about living. So that's already happening.
Correct, it is, and actually some of you, Michael, I think you're part of this. We're embarking on a new downtown plan, and the goal is to really minimize the access for cars. I don't know if you've noticed all of our bike lanes, which are still mostly empty, which is very annoying to me because I hate that investment in infrastructure that's not used. Plus it slows my car down. But we are looking at getting rid of a lot of our parking lots. We're having bike facilities installed. I don't know if you've noticed all the bike loops all downtown. And we've got bike lanes that'll be coming in too. The voters have recently approved an extension of the income tax to allow us to improve our roads, including adding bike lanes on almost all of the new road improvements that we'll be putting in over the next 7 years. So yes, we are starting to do that, but there's a lot of resistance from the public because we like our cars. This is Michigan, and we love cars. And so to get people to give up their cars, you have to have regular, steady transit, and it has to be affordable, and you have to have a place to leave your bike if you want people to ride.
Thanks. I'm very quickly realizing this could go on for some time. And we do have a bit of a time limit, so I want to make one point and ask another question, and you had something I think you wanted to say. The one point I want to make, and Anthony, it's a little bit off of your earlier question where I was bragging about West Michigan. Well, here comes a brag, because the furniture companies were indeed the ones that got LEED started. And I don't see him in the audience. There's a guy that Steve and I both know named Keith Wynn, who was Herman Miller's person to help get that going. Keith has a firm here in Grand Rapids that continues to work with LEED and does a lot of that. He took me to his new building, which is a renovated, reclaimed building about a year ago. Keith is an incredibly humble person, and the conversation went like this. I'm going, oh, wow, this is fantastic. Oh, wow, you restored that? Oh, wow, that's great. And he said, yeah. He said, this is the most highest LEED certified building in the world. I said, in the world? He said, yeah, there's another one in India that's close, but this is really, I said, who knows that? Well, they sent me a letter. I said, no, you're missing the point here, Keith. So he did call the mayor, and there are a lot of things going on. Reed, you wanted to,
Oh, it was maybe a way to close your question about who cares, which is that the environment for making extraordinary forward leaps in dominating industries and in being a leader in whatever industry it is has shifted from what it was when Michigan first became a significant presence, when it was completely driven in the private sector or by the private sector. In today's world, there is no success in creating large-scale industries without a public-private partnership. And until the state of Michigan starts to act a little bit more like the city of Grand Rapids and realize that substantial investments are necessary to attract the industry, or another state is going to do it, we're going to continue to lag. And we've got these massive industries here. The car business here still makes 15 million vehicles every year. There aren't any other industries except computers that do that. So to have that kind of capacity, that scale available, gives us an advantage, but only when the entire system works. And this state has been really slow to get on that bandwagon, unbelievably slow. And it's not a conservative, liberal, West Michigan, East Michigan divide. It's just piss poor leadership in the governor's office for 20 years in a row. It's not party specific.
yeah, and I think some of that comes from the lack of a voice of what design is all about.
Yeah.
They're just, when I talk to the legislators that I do, they don't know who to listen to. Say, well, the architects say we're the design community. The industrial design, well, we're the design community. The graphic, well, we're the design community. So there's a little bit of confusion on where to listen to. And I think there's some efforts afoot that may indeed help with that. I want to go into one more subject, but I want to leave enough time for questions or anything that any of you have in the audience. There was a great question that came from our friend from the Park Services at a session I was sitting in on, okay, this era is called Michigan Modern, and that comes off of mid-century modern, and it's very much time dated, and it gives you sort of an instant impression. What do you call now? What are we now? When one thinks of looking back, where are we? And how can we define this era? And I love the question because it causes us to look at where we are, but more importantly, it causes us to look like where we should go.
When you're in the middle of one of those eras, it doesn't have that same thing. They weren't sitting around in the 1940s and 30s and 50s and going, yeah, man, we're in the middle of mid-century modernism. This is changing everything. What it looked like to those people was this little husband and wife design team out in Los Angeles that's feeding a kind of mid-scale furniture industry in Michigan and producing weird furniture that nobody wants to buy. I mean, that certainly doesn't, it didn't look like what it feels like now. John and Tenza gave up after 8 houses. That changes the world, 8 houses. So it's only the lens of looking backwards that allows us to feel it. So right now, I would imagine that a lot of us, certainly people who find themselves in leadership, are asking, where are we now? What is this thing? And if you can answer that, you become the next big thing.
Yeah,
you become the leader.
And that's the point, Reed. If we're learning that it's difficult to look at that during the point in time, let's get better at looking at it so we know what to capitalize on the resources and capabilities that are moving forward.
So are you asking that for Michigan?
I am.
Okay.
No, I'm asking for big picture, and then I think Michigan will absolutely find it's already there.
But I wouldn't ask for a label. What I would ask for is a vision of what needs to get solved and how do we proceed knowing what we know now and knowing our amazing ability to invent, to invest, to be enthusiastic about new ideas, to explore new solutions that are appropriate, that are humane, that are now environmentally connected, reconnected in a really serious way to the environment. So when we start asking that, when we start putting that big vision in front of us, really, truly, then I think we're going to start redefining things. I mean, I know that there is a living building, at least one, in Michigan, at least one. Now, a living building, as you all know, is not taking energy from any source except the sun, the wind, geothermal, and it is so well designed that it needs minimum energy. And so that is happening all over the country, all over the world. It should happen more often here because you have availability of wind resources, water resources. So I just think that it's now the vision. The vision was modernizing. The vision at the time that all of this happened was the Ford factory was spewing out all this stuff. It wowed the world. It created this mystique about what America could do, and everybody wanted to latch onto it because it was so inventive, so positive, so beneficial to society at that time. So I think how do we define it? What do we say that it is? And sustainability doesn't work. It's the word that is really loaded. Green design is too limiting. I mean, all of the words that we use are very basically inadequate. And so we really need to think about what our vision is and what your vision specifically is for this state.
I must say I really like the thought of a vision versus a label.
Yeah.
That's very nice. Reed?
Every now and again, society goes through fundamental shifts.
Yeah.
Fundamental shifts. The biggest one that we like to write about and talk about happened at the end of the 19th century, the last 30 years, where we shifted from an agrarian to a manufacturing economy. And absolutely everything changed with it. Everything. And design is a little, teeny, tiny piece of that. It's an enabler, but it's just a small piece of it. We clearly are in the middle of one of those shifts again. And that shift is driven by one simple thing, digital information and the digital distribution of information. That's allowed us to send things around the world, but also delve deeply within ourselves to unlock the fundamental mysteries of how the world and our bodies and everything else work. That's where we are. There's no question about it. And that's not me, that's everybody writing that. The question is what we do with it. And the second fundamental shift that's going on right now that I think we're only beginning to talk about is the radical revision of the time frame in which we live. We're just starting to figure out how much faster everything goes than it used to. It actually does now go much faster, and it's not because we're over 50. It's because things are moving at the pace of change is so radically different than what it was. That's going to have another fundamental shift for us.
You know, a guy named John Nesbitt wrote a book in the 80s called Megatrends. And he was talking about the transition in the same way as societies and talking about how we're going into the technical, high-tech society, and made the point of high-tech, high-touch. That his belief that the next trend, because of the high tech, was absolutely a focus and a need to be much more interpersonal and much more interactive with your own space. I think it's interesting. Anthony?
I guess I would reflect on, if we're going to talk about some of the bigger changes that are going on, one thing that comes to mind is the notion of economy. And in the 1930s, well, specifically in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, we saw the kind of burgeoning free market economy. This notion of, which we have to remember, in the 1930s and the early 40s in both America and Europe, socialism was still a kind of base philosophy for many in the Western world. Then we shifted over in the 1950s and 60s to a kind of consumer market and free market economy. I think today the notion of economy has gone in, with the crisis we've recently seen, I'm not sure if those models of economy are as solid for moving forward as we might imagine that they are. And then I would ask, what is the role of a new kind of economy, maybe even a post-consumer economy or a post-free market economy? I do think there's a third way that we're starting to see. Last summer, I spent the summer in Medellin in Colombia, and we've seen incredible new things that are happening in urbanism and design there that are looking at public-private partnerships, looking at a renewed interest in state planning, but not in the old-fashioned sense, not in the welfare sense, but a kind of interesting model, a hybrid model between free market and state government that is encouraging a brand new notion of what design can be, specifically in some of the poorest areas. Transportation's at the forefront, as well as kind of environmental sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's a new notion of economy that we should think about, and it's not clear to me yet what that role in America might be.
Yeah, I heard someone who I can't remember makes the point that the economic distress of different countries in the world and all of that have been one of the biggest benefactors to really good design, because it causes a new thinking on new things, and I think we may be going through that. I want to open up to any of you who want to either ask questions or have comments for any of our good folks up here, or make your own comment relative to your time and experience here and learning. You first.
Just an observation. I was here for the SAH in Detroit 2 years ago. I was here last year for the first Michigan Modern in Cranbrook. I'm here for the second Michigan Modern, and I appreciate how much I've learned about the history of designers and architects, especially at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. When I went to architectural school in the 1970s at Clemson and University of Florida, we never heard about Albert Kahn. Modernism began with Sullivan, Burnham and Root, and Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago. That was the birthplace of modernism. But why don't we hear more about Albert Kahn, or has history been properly rewritten since the time I went to school? I really appreciate the history that I've learned from coming here to Michigan.
The people from SHPO deserve a lot of credit for the raising of up of Albert Kahn. I got into a snippy argument in the early days of the planning of this about whether Albert Kahn had invented modernism. I still don't believe he did, because he rejected it verbally in many ways. But the person bringing it up, one of the SHPO staffers, was dead on accurate, that he didn't invent it himself. Other people came and saw it and invented it from that. And so it was a sharing technique. Why wasn't it there before? Because we didn't have people pushing it out the way we do now in Lansing in that office. And thank God for them, because that's a message that needed to get out.
Anthony,
Yes, I can respond. As far as why did we not know about him throughout the 30s and 40s is one question. Why do we learn about him in the 1960s is another question. Yeah. In 1964, Rainer Banham wrote an article called Towards a Pop Architecture. And in that article, in a polemic he raised, which was he staged Albert Kahn and all the other commercial architects that had been dismissed from the high legacy of modernism. And he goes into this and argues, and in that same article, he also talks about many of the Michigan designers, including Bel Geddes, et cetera, et cetera. And he shows why those designers had not been included in the kind of respectable history of modernism. And so in the 60s, we see a revision of architectural history. Rainer Banham certainly played an important role, and he was obsessed with Detroit, and all of that was happening here. So we learn about him much, much later. That's one of the first references I know in '64. Following that, in the 80s and 90s, we see a whole new history that's being rewritten. But it's important and interesting to reflect, why was he excluded from that early history?
Because it was unconscious modernism.
Absolutely.
He was not a modernist. Exactly. He rejected modernism in the way that the modernists in Europe adapted it. But he was a modernist without realizing it. He was a different kind of, he was a pre-Venturi modernist. Someone who could build a modern frame and wrap it in anything he wanted. And that was brilliant.
It goes into a long dispute as to what is modern design.
What is
that
modern?
is absolutely not clear, and there's as many definitions as you could.
This is why you didn't hear about it. Eggheads like the two of us arguing in private little rooms in the back of a university.
But you do know that the oldest continually practicing architectural firm in the United States is based in Detroit.
Yes, I do know that.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Did you work there, John? Was it called the Smith Group? Yes. Smith, Hinchman, and Grillis? Yeah.
Well,
with the invigoration presentation, and thank you, John, for bringing these experts on stage today. My question is, what does it take and what's stopping us from making this a wow exhibit in places like Los Angeles and New York, where high-quality symposium like this could also take place to push this even further?
There's the answer right there. Ask that man.
I was going to say, I know who to ask. You know, I probably also know the answer. But Brian, if I am about to embarrass you, that's fine. But it is an interesting question. Are there any opportunities, or what might be involved to have something like this exhibit or like these symposiums be elsewhere in the country?
Can I add to that? What would it take to make Grand Rapids the center of an international experimental laboratory that looks at urbanism and environmental design?
Right.
Well, I can answer the first part of the question, which has to do with money. No, when we first came up with this idea, we knew that the story was there. We just really wanted to push it out. And what one of our intents was, and I'm very pleased to see this discussion here today, our intent was not only to look at the history, but make the statement that Michigan is still here as a design state. And I think we're starting to do that with John's work, or John's been doing this for a long time, but we're kind of latching onto that. And all of you here need to go out and spread that word. And I would certainly be open to anybody who has any connections to any other venue that would like to have a discussion about bringing it here. We approached Dana Freens Hansen at the Grand Rapids Art Museum to bring it here. He's not here, so I can say initially he was a little hesitant. We went to Reed and Greg Whitcup in Cranbrook, and they latched onto it right away because, of course, Cranbrook is a huge part of the story. But I think Greg has told me at Cranbrook it was very successful, one of your top exhibits. Dana has indicated that as well. And we also felt it was real important to bring it to an art museum venue rather than a historical museum venue, because the story would get lost, as we've talked about. It's not just about looking at your history, it's about starting this kind of discussion. So I'd be very interested in speaking with anybody who would like to see this move forward. We, of course, those of you in the museum world know that putting together an exhibition like this, there's a tremendous amount of work in collecting all the materials to go into the exhibition. A good percentage is on loan. The rest is owned by the State Historic Preservation Office. We do intend to consolidate it into at least a traveling exhibition, probably in a smaller scale, but if anybody's interested in a larger exhibition, I'd be glad to speak with them. Or a symposium.
One more question. I know there's one back there, and then we're going to need to wrap. And Brian, I'll give you the last words.
I just wanted to speak to the term modernism, and maybe this is an oversimplification, but I've never seen it as needing to be tied to an era. It really is about an attitude that embraces that futurist visionary and applies it in the world in a practical way using design. So I think we can even say now that this is Michigan modern, because I think that the modernism really still has some true value and looks forward.
That feels like a rap comment.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
So let's thank our panelists from joining us here. I'm delighted, Anthony, Susan, Reed. Thank you very much.